TFA fam, welcome back in. We are on to week 9. It is time for our week 9 wide receiver rankings. Let's not waste any time. Let's go ahead and dive right into it. Our wide receiver ones for week 9 are as follows. We have Tyreek Hill, A.J. Brown, Jamar Chase, Stephon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb, Keenan Allen, Adam Thielen, Mike Evans, Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, Cooper Kupp, and Chris Olave rounding out our top 12 wide receivers for the week. Not going to bore you with any details here. If you have any of these top 12 guys, you're starting them, especially in a week where we have bye weeks, we have injuries, we have a bunch of backup quarterbacks starting. So if you have any of these top 12 guys, you're starting them. So let's go ahead and just jump right over to our wide receiver 2s and talk about some of these guys. Our rankings there start off at wide receiver 13 with DK Metcalf, Michael Pittman, Nico Collins, Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson, DeAndre Hopkins, DJ Moore, Puka Nacua, T. Higgins, Terry McLaurin, George Pickens, and Zay Flowers, rounding out our wide receiver 2s. So let's kick it off with Garrett Wilson. This is the highest I've had him ranked probably since week 1. He's been wide receiver 16 and wide receiver 18 in half PPR scoring the past 2 weeks, and that's without scoring a touchdown either. Now he gets a matchup against the Chargers, who are allowing the 3rd most half PPR points per game to the position, including the 6th most yards, and they're tied for giving up the 4th most touchdowns. Wilson also has at least 12 targets in 3 of his last 4, which has helped push him to 4th in target share and 2nd in air yard share on the season. Nico Collins gets a matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have been solid all year defensively, but they have been allowing some production and fantasy points to the wide receiver position. They're giving up the 9th most half PPR points per game to wideouts, and that includes allowing double-digit points to 11 different receivers on the season. 3 of those came in the last game, where we saw Diggs, Khalil Shakir, and Gabe Davis all have at least 11.5 points against them. So I'm going back to Nico Collins this week. Michael Pittman, the Carolina Panthers did a really good job of keeping Nico Collins and his wide receiver mate Tank Dell in check last week. But we know Gardner Minshew is going to be slinging it all around and being the DGAF god that he is. Pittman has seen more than a 27% target share on the year. That's good for 15th among all wide receivers. And this game does have one of the higher totals of the week, which is currently sitting at 44. So I like Pittman here as a wide receiver 2 in week 9. DeAndre Hopkins had himself a vintage D-Hop game last week, putting up 3 touchdowns for over 100 yards. Now, I'm not going to get carried away here and throw him up in the wide receiver 1 conversation, but he does get the Steelers on Thursday night, and that defense ain't what it used to be. They're allowing the 4th most half PPR points per game to opposing wideouts. We saw Will Levis be more than capable in his first game in his rookie season last week. So D-Hop is definitely in the wide receiver 2/flex conversation of wideout this week. Someone who did not put up the points last week was Devontae Adams. He's been incredibly frustrating all season long. He only has 1 wide receiver 1 finish in half PPR scoring on the year. That was all the way back in week 3 going up against the Steelers. Coincidentally, outside of that, he's had just 2 wide receiver 2 finishes. This Raider team is an absolute dumpster fire. We saw the head coach get fired. We saw the GM get fired on Halloween. Jimmy G has been benched. Looks like we're going to get Aiden O'Connell at quarterback, which isn't necessarily an awful thing for D-Hop. In the one game that O'Connell started this year, we saw Adams put up a 33% target share. So he's also going to get a matchup against the Giants, so it's not a defense that we're worried about, especially without Leonard Williams up front causing disruption. So you can go back to Devontae Adams, but he's obviously way more volatile than we would like, especially considering where you likely drafted him earlier in the year. 2 wide receivers that I am much lower on than Kev this week is Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. They're dropping for me dramatically, with Brett Rippon set to make his 4th career start and his 1st since week 15 of the 2021-2022 season. He was fine in those games, but I'm still not excited about it. The Packers are allowing the 10th fewest half PPR points per game to wide receivers on the season. I do think that's a little misleading considering who they played and how their schedule has played out so far up to this point. And with the Packers trading away Rasul Douglas, it does help a little bit, but I'm still not going to be excited to start any of these guys. They've both dropped down outside of the top 20 wide receivers for me personally. And lastly, among the wide receiver 2s for me is going to be Deontay Johnson. He's in a really nice spot here going up against the Titans on Thursday night. This is a secondary that's allowed the seventh most half PPR points per game to the position. And last week, we really saw Deontay dominate targets. He put up a whopping 42% target share across 14 targets last week. I certainly expect this to even back out a little bit, but Deontay now has seen 20 targets, catching 13 of those for 164 yards since returning 2 weeks ago. Moving on to the wide receiver threes for this week. Amari Cooper is going to kick it off for us at wide receiver 25, followed by Deontay Johnson, Gabe Davis, Chris Godwin, Jacoby Myers, Josh Downs, Rashee Rice, Tyler Lockett, Josh Palmer, Drake London, Marquise Brown, and Tank Dell at wide receiver 36. Looking at Drake London, he has certainly rebounded nicely considering how his year started all the way back in week 1. He has now had at least 5 catches for 50 yards in 4 straight games. Taylor Heineke has been named the starter for Washington. I think that's an upgrade over Desmond Ridder at quarterback. Hopefully, we see Arthur Smith stick with this throughout the rest of the season. The Vikings have allowed the 6th most half PPR points per game to the position, so you can fire up London as a flex option at worst. Rashee Rice, the Chiefs as a whole across the offense were pretty booty last week in the Pat Mahomes flu game. Rice was still solid, though. He caught 4 for 56 on 5 targets, and that was second across the board for the Chiefs, behind only to Kelsey. And as disappointing as it was, Rice did have the highest route participation among Chiefs wide receivers, and that's something we've been waiting for a couple weeks now. So especially in this game in Germany, we're expecting to see some fantasy fireworks here. So you can go back to plugging in Rice into your lineups this week. I'm higher on Deontay Johnson. Kevin's higher on George Pickens, but obviously with Pickens, the same stats obviously apply here that did with me talking about Deontay Johnson. I do think he gets more involved. Obviously, his week was saved last week with the one catch he did have was for a touchdown, but I expect that to be more balanced, like I said. So Pickens is right back into your starting lineups. And then in a similar situation is Tank Dell. I think we see CJ Stroud bounce back. I think Tank Dell is more involved outside of, getting some rush attempts here as well. So I like him. And then lastly, among the wide receiver threes, Jordan Addison obviously takes a hit with Kirk Cousins having torn his Achilles and going from him to Josh Dobbs. But Dobbs has at least been serviceable. This passing offense is still going to go through Addison and Hawkinson. The issue here is obviously that ceiling just evaporates for Jordan Addison, right? So he becomes much more of a floor play going forward, but I still like him. And then outside of the top 36 wide receivers, if you need some deeper options, Rashid Shaheed for the Saints is always going to make for a viable boom bust option. We're talking about a dude who has 3 finishes inside the top 11 this year, and then literally everything else is outside of the top 53. He's the definition of boom bust, but here in this matchup going up against the Chicago Bears, you can feel good about plugging him in as that boom bust option in your lineup. Jahan Dotson finally decided to make an appearance this week, and as long as Curtis Samuel is going to be out, which I expect that he will, there's no reason to think that his involvement shouldn't carry over from last week into this week. Yes, Jamison Crowder also decided to make an appearance and rise from the fantasy dead, but I also think the fact that Sam Howell dropped back 52 times against the Eagles last week had a lot to do with that. I do expect more of a neutral game type script for Washington going up against New England in this one. So Jahan Dotson is another option you have in week 9. Tyler Boyd is in an interesting spot. He only saw 3 targets last week, but he did score a touchdown. Now he's finished as wide receiver 25 and 16 in his last 2 games. Does get a good matchup against Teron Johnson and the Bills. Johnson has allowed the 11th most yards in the slot, so if you're desperate, this game does look to be a shootout. We have a total of 49.5 points in this one, so Tyler Boyd does make some sense. And lastly, Demario Douglas for the Pats. We have Kendrick Bourne on IR, Devontae Parker very unlikely to play with a concussion. And because of this shitstorm, we saw Douglas lead the Pats in snaps and routes run last week. So if you're in need of a hope and a prayer, if you need someone that is likely widely available for you to go pick up off of waivers, Demario Douglas is your guy. That is going to do it for the Week 9 wide receiver rankings. Appreciate you rocking with me through this. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments below. We'll also be going live on Wednesday night to answer your start-sit questions. You can also jump into our free Discord channel. The link is in the description below. Hope you all have a great Week 9, and I'll talk to you soon.